The thing is, whenever I look at a political movement, especially an ideological movement, I think, okay, there's a bunch of things you're for, fine. What are you against? You know, because one of the things that people who adopt an ideological position like to presume is that all of the right is on their side. And that makes them very unconscious of their shadow, let's say, from a Jungian perspective. The Nazis had all sorts of positive reasons for what they were doing. But, you know, the negative reasons were there too, and you could easily make it a case that the negative reasons were really the reasons. And when I look at ideologues, I always think, yeah, that's what you're for, sure. But A, I don't believe all the good people are on your side. And B, I know that negative motivations are more powerful than positive ones. So you say you're for things, but you're against them too. So let's start with that. So I started thinking about this after I'd read George Orwell. I love George Orwell, by the way. How many of you know who George Orwell is? Wow, really? That's impressive. How many don't? Okay, well that's good. That's amazing. How the hell did you learn about George Orwell? Is it 1984 fundamentally, or Animal Farm? Animal Farm. Animal Farm. Okay, well that's good, because George Orwell, man, I tell you, George Orwell was the first Western intellectual who figured out what the hell was going on in the Soviet Union. And he did that in the mid-40s, early. You know, it was complicated because we sort of knew what was happening in the 20s and the 30s. You know, there was Lenin, and that wasn't so good. There was the Russian Civil War. There was the idea of universal communism. That wasn't such a good idea, you know, for as far as people who didn't want to be communist were concerned. And then there was what happened in the Ukraine in the 1930s. So it was like, yeah, you know, the evidence was starting to pile up. But unfortunately, what happened was the Spanish Civil War, and the lefties were pretty much the good guys in the Spanish Civil War, right? It was like a microcosm of the Second World War. The lefties were fighting the fascists, and some of the lefties were communists, but a lot of them were also people who were, I think, genuinely fighting for freedom. And a lot of North American literary figures went to Spain to fight on the side of the, you know, against the fascists. And so fair enough, you know, the fascists were obviously, you know, reprehensible, clearly. And so that kind of muddied the water, right? Because the fascists were bad, and then that sort of means that people that are fighting them, they're good, and some of them are communists, and there was pretty good reason for people to be radically socialist at that point in human history, because the plight of the working man was relatively unpleasant. George Orwell wrote a book called Road to Wigan Pier, and he went up to this town that was a coal mining town, and he stayed with the coal miners for a while and just looked at their life. So here's part of their life. So you basically work a 7.5-hour shift when you're a coal miner, and you think, oh, that's not too bad by 1930 standards. It's like, yeah, except you have to go down to the coal mine tunnels, you know, and like they're not 8 feet high and carpeted. They're like 4.5 feet high and rough and poorly lit, and the air is terrible. And so basically you have to chimp walk or crawl up to 3 miles just to get to work. And then you have to do that at the end of your shift. And you don't get paid for that. That's your commute. Right. So, you know, it was no bloody, well, and then of course what you're doing when you get there is like, it's absolutely filthy. It's unbelievably noisy. It's brutally difficult. He said that coal miners, they had no teeth because of their living conditions, but their bodies were absolutely perfect. They were unbelievably powerful and strong because all they did was incredibly intense physical labor. But it was bloody rough. And the housing those people had is like 50 families for one outhouse. That's probably good enough to describe it. And often they were row houses, and the row houses had no back doors. And they had no paths between them, and all the outhouses were at the back. So that meant if you were, it was like 20 below and it was the winter and you were sick, then you get to go all the way around the block to your damn outhouse, or maybe there's only one there, and you line up with 50 people so that, you know, yeah, so. And Orwell was an upper class guy, basically, and he was trying to have himself overcome his upper class prejudices. So he was a real documentarian of the terrible working conditions of working class people. And he wrote this book called Road to Wigan Pier. But one of the things that Orwell said, he wrote this story about these poor goddamn coal miners, and you think, well, Yeah, it's like, how about some social legislation so that these people and their children aren't just absolutely brutalized nonstop, you know? But then he wrote the last half of the book, and he wrote it for the Left Book Club, which was a socialist group that would publish a book every month or so. And what he did was he wrote a critique of socialism, of British socialism. And he said, yeah, well, this sucks, man. It's like we should be on the side of these working people, but the socialists I meet, they're not on the side of the working people. They're like tweed-wearing, middle-class, hyper-intellectuals who never go anywhere near the working class because of their class prejudices and for all sorts of other reasons. And they don't like the poor at all. They just hate the rich. And I thought, I had been a member of the NDP for a long time at that point. There was always something a little off about it, especially the more radical end. I thought, what's with you guys? Like, it doesn't look like benevolence as far as I can tell. There's a lot of whining and complaining and resentment. It's like, what's that about? I read Orwell and I thought, aha, right. If you hate the successful, if you hate the rich, rich, by the way, is whoever has more money than you. That's how you define rich. And the best way to mask your resentment is to pretend that you're on the side of the poor. And I read that and I thought, that's exactly right. And then that's part of also what made me psychoanalytically oriented. Because one thing psychoanalysts always do, always, is if you say here's how I'm positively predisposed, the psychoanalyst says, how are you using that to mask something easy and malevolent that you're doing? And that's a very, very useful question. It's not always correct, right? But it's correct a lot more than people generally like to think. You know, it's like the mother or the witch in Hansel and Gretel. You know the story, right? This guy gets married, he's got a couple of kids, his new wife doesn't really like the kids. You have 100 times higher chance, by the way, of being abused by a step-parent than a biological parent, just so you know. So the stepmother doesn't like the kids. She tells the guy, well, why don't you just go put those kids out in the woods? So out they go, out in the woods. So they're lost kids, right? They have nowhere to go. So they're wandering around out there in the forest. And what happens? And they come across a gingerbread house. You think, wow, man, you're a starving kid. Gingerbread house. That's good news, right? Not only is it a house, but it's made out of candy. How could anything possibly be any better? So in they go. Well, and then there's this grandmotherly type in there, and you know, she starts to fatten them up, and she puts, I think it's Hansel in a cage, and she gets Gretel after a while to basically work as their scullery maid, and it becomes quite obvious to the children that she's actually fattening them up so that she can put them in the oven and eat them. And so I think what Hansel does is, I think Gretel gives him this like bone from some animal, and the old witch is half blind, and every time she reaches in to sort of feel his leg, he gives her the bone, and so like she's just not all that interested in eating him. And anyways, the kids end up pushing her in the oven and closing it and getting the hell out of there. So, you know, it's a happy ending as far as fairy tales go. But it's an Oedipal story, right? It's a classic story about an Oedipal family. Be bloody wary of people who do too much for you. Right. It's like if you have a mother, or any other relative for that matter, who's fattening you up on mercy and candy, the probability that her basic goal is to eat you enough so that you never leave, the probability is extraordinarily high. And that's no joke. You know, one of the things that you do learn if you read about the sorts of people who burst out of their mother's basement and go shoot up Dawson College is that often that's exactly the situation they've been in. Right? They're burning with resentment in their uselessness down in the basement for 5 or 6 years. You know, they don't have to leave. They don't have to become independent. Everything's done for them. So they never have to do anything for themselves. It's like, it's not pretty. And so one of the rules for dealing with people, and I know this is actually a rule for dealing with elderly people in homes for retired people, is do not do anything for anyone they can do for themselves. You're stealing from them when you do that. And it's a great rule of thumb for kids. Like, once they can dress themselves, they dress themselves. If they can set the table, even if it takes 20 minutes, it's like they're setting the table. You're not doing them a favor by helping them do anything they can do themselves. And it's kind of harsh, you know, but it beats the hell out of the witch in Hansel and Gretel. So anyways, you know, one of the things we're going to look at as well is the dark side of positive motivations.